Here's the selectors test page, which is included within the course files. I'll go ahead and run the application so you can see what it does. View that in the browser. And what it does is it lets you include various selectors and test them out on the HTML over here on the right-hand side of the page. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to select all of the image elements on the page. I can enter that, click on the Submit button, and you can see that there's now this red border around all of the images in the HTML. And as you can see, we have various list items, a table, anchor tags, checkboxes, and so forth, some headers, text, and so forth. One of the things that the page does is that it shows you the jQuery statement that it is using in order to select these different elements. Now, the code behind the page is actually doing a little bit more because it's having to actually go out and apply a class to each of the selected elements so you can visually see them selected on the page. It also is going through and indicating the number of selected elements as well as the tag name. And if it has an ID value, it provides the ID value as well. So it's giving you some feedback about selectors so that you can play with different kinds of scenarios. And you can get a little bit more complex with your selectors. So let's say that I wanted to select all of the input text boxes and the images in the right-hand side of the page. So I can put in image, comma, input. So those are two tag names, which is a form of selectors in jQuery. But I specifically want the text boxes, not the other input types. So I can include an attribute value of input text, input equals text. And I'll submit that. And now you can see that we have this red border as well as yellow background on the text box. And that's the only text box on the page, as well as the images. And here you can see the resulting jQuery statement that uses this selector to select images and all input elements of type text. And here you can see the input element has a name, has an ID value actually, of called text name, and that's listed in the list there as well. All right, so we're going to be using this quite extensively in this section in order to explore selectors. There's also a clear button there, so it clears everything, your selectors, and undoes the changes here, and so forth. Just keep in mind that the selectors that you enter on this side are applying only to the HTML on the right side of the page. So the nice thing about this is that jQuery includes the ability, as part of selecting elements on the page, to select only a subset of elements on the page. So in fact, in that previous selector that I used, this text box was not highlighted with a red border and a yellow background, because this text box is not in the subset of the page where the jQuery method applied. All right, so I'll shut that down for the moment. And here's the source code behind it. Now this is a little bit complex jQuery. It's getting into a little bit more realistic an example. But here you can see it's using the ready method in order to wire up different buttons. So this is wiring up that form selector submit button. And it's going to do things like clear the results. Each time you submit a new selector, it's going to clear the results so that the new selector only highlights the new match set that you specify. And then it does various things to get the entered selector, trim it, and return if there's nothing there. So if the user doesn't enter a selector, it just returns false and does nothing else. And then it highlights the wrapped set. And this is the statement that I really wanted to point out. So what this is doing is it's taking that selector text, that set of matched elements, and then it is going to apply an action to the subset of elements on the page that are child elements of sample HTML. So this is being passed as the second parameter. If you don't pass this parameter, this add class method is going to apply to the entire set of elements on the page, including the text box and the other elements and the content on the left side of the page. But we only want the right side of the page, and that's wrapped in a div element called sample HTML. And I'll talk more about the add class method, jQuery method a little bit later, but all it's doing is it's adding this wrapped set class, CSS class, to the selected elements. So again, if you enter that selector with the image tags and all the input elements of type text, it's going to add this class to that set of elements. And as you imagine, that CSS is what takes care of adding the border and the yellow background. All right, then it does various other user interface stuff, and there's the clear button there, clears the results. And the clear results here removes that class from all of the selected elements, and then clears the span statement, the element count, and the div results, all the stuff on the left-hand side. All right, then the rest of the page is pretty much just straight HTML. I just wanted to include a number of different kinds of elements, some buttons, spans, divs, lots of paragraphs. Here's some input elements, radio buttons, some checkboxes with different names here. This is Alaska. This is various activities that you can do in Alaska. Text box there with your name. And there's various images, some of our dogs. If you come out to our house when you visit Alaska, you might meet some of these dogs. And then unordered list. And then finally a table with a variety of information about different cities as well as some links. Okay? So pretty straightforward HTML, but it provides a lot of different kinds of elements on the page that you can use in order to play with jQuery selectors. And you can also add and remove whatever HTML that you want to within the sample file within the course. Let's get into the details now about how selectors work. This is going to be a big part of you using jQuery effectively, so it's definitely worthwhile to take some time to learn the different features and really explore how to use them efficiently. So a selector is the string that identifies which elements on the page that you want to add to the wrapped set. And the wrapped set is a collection of elements that the jQuery statement will take one or more actions on. So by providing a selector, you're defining which elements are going to be changed or affected or whatever happens, whatever you want that jQuery method to do. These are the elements on the page that are going to have that action applied to them. Now sometimes you want something simple, like selecting all of the images on the page like I showed you. Other times you need something much more complex, such as maybe to select all of the elements that have the class highlight, class that's named highlight, that are the last elements in a group series and contain a link. The jQuery selector syntax can easily handle that kind of a complex selector. Now what we're going to do first is explore how to create selectors to select elements based on the type of element, their ID values, and the presence of attributes or their specific values, as well as their position in the hierarchy of the DOM. And you can go far beyond that, but that's a good way to get started. Now it's important to keep in mind that the selector syntax is based on CSS3, Cascading Style Sheets 3, which is the third version of that specification. jQuery selectors are both a subset and a superset of CSS3 selectors, but they share the same syntax. So if you understand CSS selectors, you're going to have a head start on learning those in jQuery, although you still have to learn some of the particulars in what's available in jQuery. But it's really one of the beautiful things about jQuery in how they took an existing technology that's closely related to what they were doing and adapted it for their own use and really didn't need to change it all that much. Now, one very big thing to understand is that jQuery's use of these CSS3 style selectors is not dependent on the browser's implementation of CSS3. CSS3 is really still an emerging standard. And newer versions of browsers are starting to implement features, but no browser that I know of fully implements all of CSS3 because it's not really even an fully approved standard yet. But the browser itself doesn't need to support CSS3. The selector syntax is built into jQuery, so the browser can run the jQuery code. It'll select the correct elements and so forth, but it doesn't itself have to support CSS3. So that's something that oftentimes is confusing. The browser doesn't need to support CSS3. The easiest way of using selectors is to define a selector to simply use the HTML element name. And examples would be an image tag, a row, an anchor tag, input, etc. This is just the tag name, the HTML tag name. And the effect of using that element name is to select all of the elements of that type on the page. So that sounds a little bit simplistic, but let's take a look at how you can put that to good use. Here we are back in the selector test page. The first example I'll do is type in TD for a table row and submit that. And as you can see, we have 33 TD elements. You need to scroll down to see that. And you can see that they're all highlighted. Notice that the column headers are not highlighted. Those are TH elements. But if you were to put the headers in TD elements, those would have been highlighted as well. That's one of the things that you very quickly learn about using jQuery selectors, is that it almost demands that you use good HTML design and not get sloppy like doing things like putting headers, table headers within TD elements, because then that destroys your ability to use the jQuery features easily in order to access just the rows of the table. You could still do it. There's ways of writing selectors in order to exclude those header elements or any of the rows that you want, but your selector just gets a lot more complex. I'll clear that option and now put in an anchor tag. As you can see, we have 15 links on the page. All of the links to the outdoor organizations are selected, as well as a few contents of table cells. So the thing to understand here is that this is going to select all of the anchor tags throughout this portion of the page. Remember that the jQuery statement is limiting itself to this right part of the page. But whether or not the links are within text, within a LI element, within TD element, wherever they are in the page, you'll get a reference to them and can take action on them using a jQuery method. Now, as you saw a little bit earlier, you're not limited to entering only a single element in the selector. You can select a variety of element types using a comma-delimited list. And here's another variation on that, where I want to select all of the button elements, the H3 elements, and any caption elements. And I can click on Submit. As you can see, we have a few H3 elements. Scroll back up to the top here. So we have an H3 there, and another one there, an element that's highlighted right there. And then this is the caption element. I used a caption tag in order to give the table a name. Now, one pretty powerful option, albeit one that you won't use all that often, is the asterisk selector. So when I put an asterisk in there and click on Submit, it selects every element on the page, or at least within this section of the page. As you can see, there's 140 of them, and you can scroll down and see all of the different elements that are highlighted. Now, selecting every element on the page and putting a 2-pixel wide red border around it and highlighting yellow, it kind of destroys the layout of the page. As you can see, the checkboxes have kind of gotten out of line there and so forth. But this isn't something that you're generally going to do. You're generally not going to want to select every element on the page, because, well, I can't even imagine what you would want to take action on every element in the page for. But it shows the power of jQuery. If you need to do it, you've got the power there. You just probably won't want to change the visual rendering of every element on the page like this does. So it's a pretty gaudy result, but it certainly makes the point about the effect of that particular selector. All right, so I'll clear that. Now, another common need for selecting elements is using either the ID or class attributes. So jQuery has selectors for that. And like CSS, you identify that you want to match on the ID value by including a hash symbol as a prefix to the ID value. So if I go back over to the source for the page and come down here into the HTML and into my sample HTML section, I can come down here and see that we have an input element of type text, and it has an ID value of txt name. If I wanted to select that particular element, I could go back over to my selector page and put in hash or pound txt name. and that's going to select that element. I'll need to scroll back up here, and there you can see the text box has been highlighted. Another thing you could do is, for example, if you wanted to select the headers of this table, we can go back over to the code here and scroll down and see that that row has an ID of column headings. So I can come back over here, clear that, and put in pound and column headings. And submit that, and now you can see that we've selected those three elements because they're all contained within that row. And that brings up an important point. Even though I am selecting on the table row, it's going to select all child elements as well, because that class is going to apply to those elements. Now, if you're anything like me, one of the errors that you're going to make often is to forget the pound symbol. I still do this all the time. If you do that and click on Submit, notice that it selects no elements. The reason is because it's not looking for any kind of generic name contained anywhere. In this case, without the hash sign or the pound symbol, it's going to look for an HTML element with a tag name of column headings. Now, HTML itself does not have such a tag, and there's a pretty good chance that your custom HTML is not going to have that element as well. So if you ever get into a situation where you put in a selector, it really looks right. Make absolute sure that if you're selecting by an ID value, that you have that hash symbol in there. All right, yet another option is to select by CSS class. This also uses the CSS syntax of preceding the class name with a period. If we go back once again to the source code and back up to the list elements, you can see that a couple of the LI elements have a city class name. Anchorage doesn't, and then Juneau does again. And in fact, Juneau also has the capital class name. So I can come back over here and type in .city to select on the city class and submit that. And notice that now we get highlighted the LI elements that have the city class applied to them. And in this case, it's Fairbanks and Juneau. And notice that the entire element is highlighted because these list items are contained within this list item. We have a nested list item situation. And I may have misspoke a little bit. These have not been selected and highlighted, but they're highlighted within the border and the yellow highlighting because they're contained within a parent element that is highlighted that way. But jQuery is only selecting the two LI elements, Fairbanks and Juneau, as you can see here within the list of selected elements. Now, there are two nice things about selecting by class names. The first is that the elements that it selects are going to include all elements associated with that class, even if they're different element types. So let's say that that city class was associated with the line item elements, as well as some of the cell rows and some input elements. Then all of those elements are going to be selected using this selector. And all of those elements become part of the selected set of elements. The other nice thing is that if an element has two or more classes associated with it, which is the case with Juneau, remember that it also has capital class assigned to it, jQuery does the right thing and isn't searching for the entire value of the class attribute on the element, but is intelligently looking to see if that class is assigned to a particular element. So even though Juneau also has the capital class, it is selected when I select the city class name. So it's really pretty sweet how the jQuery team implemented some functionality to just work the way you really expected that it should. All right, so that's the class name selector. Most commonly, you're going to use this form of a selector either to select all of the elements on a page because you're actually going to do something to them. And generally, those are going to be elements of the same type, like all just LI elements or text boxes or something like that. Or you're going to select that class because you want to add a class or remove that class from the elements. And you'll see examples of how to do that sort of thing as we progress through the course. Now, CSS selectors are pretty flexible, and jQuery builds on that, giving you lots of options to select exactly the elements that you want. So for example, let's take a look again at the list of items here. So the structure here is that I have an unordered list element, and then I have 3 list items that are children of that unordered list. And then within each of those list items, I have another unordered list with a set of list items. In this case, organizations within each of the 3 biggest cities in Alaska. The reason I want to point this out is that you can create selectors that depend upon the nested structure of the page. So let's say, for example, that you wanted to select all of the LI elements that are nested within another LI element. So if I go back over to the selector page, I can type in this to accomplish that. So this is the CSS notation for selecting a list item that is a child of another list item. And I'll submit that. And now I have selected not all of the list items, but just the ones that are children of other list items. And as you can see, there's 11. Now with this notation, it's looking for all LI elements that are a descendant of another LI element. And that's necessary because there's actually that unordered list element in between these 2 different levels of list items. So you can see this unordered list. So these items were selected because this is a descendant of that element. But let's say that you have a little bit more complex a page, and you still wanted the LI descendants of LI elements, but because you have several multi-lists on the page, you only want the elements that are contained within the div organization's div element. You only want a few of them. So in this case, there's that div, and that contains all of those organizations. In order to do that, I can come back over here and just add in front the pound div organizations and li. And what this selector is going to do is it's first of all going to look for the div organizations element, more specifically the element with ID of div organizations, and then it's going to look for child LI elements and children, or descendant LI elements of that. So it is going to match these LI elements that are descendants of LI that are descendants of organizations. So now if we have other lists on the page, this is going to narrow it down to only LI elements within this page. And of course, if I select that, I get the same results because there's only a single set of LI elements on the page. So including div organizations here is a bit of overkill, but if you need that flexibility, you've got it, and it's very simple to create a selector that does that. So let's take it a little bit further. Say that you only wanted the nested LI elements where the parent has the class city associated with it. So remember, that's going to be Fairbanks and Juneau. So now what I can do is get rid of div organizations, because that's pretty redundant, and I can put in li.city li. And now what this is going to do is it's going to select all li elements that are descendants of li elements that have the class city associated with them. And I'll submit that, and you can see I have the desired effect. Only the li elements that are descendants of city li elements are selected. But let's say that you wanted to select instead direct children of elements. In that case, use the greater than bracket sign, or the greater than sign. These are child selectors. So another way of selecting all nested li elements is to do this. li greater than ul greater than greater than. And now, this is going to select all li elements that are the direct children of a ul element that is the direct child of another li element. And now we once again get selected all of these nested li elements. So overkill in this particular case, but if you have a hierarchy of elements, say for example a text box that is nested deeply within another set of elements, you can get very specific and very granular about which elements you select on the page. And this points out that one of the things you should get in the habit of doing is define the simplest selector that gets the job done, as long as the simpler selector gives you exactly the elements that you need. So that means that just li space li is going to be preferable to doing this child selector type situation, because li space li is simpler than this, and it's less work to type. You would only use this more verbose selector if there's some weirdness on the page that causes a simpler selector to not select the elements that you want. But as a practical matter, what I've found is that when I have to bump it up to a little bit more complex selector, that's a good sign that there's some problem with the HTML on the page. And it's better to go in and fix the HTML on the page if I can, rather than trying to write more complex selectors to get around sloppy HTML design. Another thing to point out is that when you write a selector like this, descendants and childs, it's not selecting any of these other elements that are up this chain of hierarchical elements. It's only going to select the last item in the chain. So really the way to read this is that you want to select all li elements that are the direct child of an ul element that in turn is a direct child of an li element. It's not selecting on these other elements, it's just selecting the furthest descendant element. And there's lots of other features within jQuery that allow you to move up and down the hierarchy of HTML. All right, so yet another selector option is to search for elements based on the presence of attributes or specific attribute values. So this uses an attribute selector syntax that uses square brackets to contain the attribute name and optionally the value. So say that you wanted to select all of the input elements on the page that have a name attribute, no matter what the value of the attribute is. Then this is the selector that would do that. It would be input, because I want all input elements, square bracket, name, square bracket. And because I haven't specified a specific value, this is going to return all input elements that have a name attribute. So I'll apply that. And as you can see, it's the collection of all of the radio buttons and the checkboxes on the page. So if we go back and look at the source code here, scroll up. Here are those radio buttons and checkboxes. As you can see, the radio buttons have the name Alaska, and the checkboxes have the name activities. And if you look through the rest of the HTML on the page, there's no other elements that have a name attribute. You'll just have to take my word on that. Now let's say that you only wanted to select the radio buttons, and specifically the radio buttons with the name Alaska. In that case, you need to specify the value in the selector. And so I can change this to name equals Alaska. And submit that. And now you can see that I've only selected those elements because those are the only elements that have a name attribute with the value of Alaska. And by the way, spaces on either side of the equal sign don't matter at all. I tend to like to put them in because it makes it a little bit more readable, but do whatever you want. Now the nice thing about this is that I really didn't even need to include the element name. Because in fact, there's no other elements on the page that have a name attribute set to Alaska, I can use this simpler selector and get the same result here. You're not limited to matching the entire value of an attribute either. Here's a table with variations that you can use. You have a lot of flexibility. So for example, in the first row, you can use the vertical bar equals in order to say that the attribute value is either equal to the specified value or starts with that value, followed by a hyphen. This is a prefix selector. Particularly with HTML5, there's going to be a lot more attribute names that have some sort of string with a dash. And those are custom attributes that you can include, and they sometimes have special meanings. And so jQuery has built-in support for that kind of selection. And then you can use the star or asterisk equal to say that the attribute value contains the specified value. The next option lets you say that the attribute value contains the specified value as a word delimited by spaces. The nice thing here is that the selector is going to match if the specified value is exactly equal to any of the words in the attribute value. And this is a word selector because very often you have a situation where you have an attribute value that consists of various words. And you don't have to worry about creating a string that has a space in the right place, and do I need a situation where it should have a space at the beginning or the end or anything like that, you can just use this version of the attribute value. And then you have the $sign equal, and that specifies that the attribute value ends with the specified value. Bang or exclamation point equal means that the element either doesn't have the specified attribute or the attribute value doesn't match the specified value. So hopefully you can start to see you have a lot of flexibility in how you create these attribute value selectors. And then finally, you can use caret equals in order to indicate that the attribute value begins with the specified value. All right, let's take a look at how you can put these attribute value selectors to work. I'm back in the HTML code of the selectors test page. Let's say that I wanted to find all of the images on the page with an alt attribute that contains Jewel. Jewel is one of our dogs. So we have several image tags here. And as you can see, we have an alt equals Jewel, as well as an alt equals Jewel in pixel. You might have noticed one of the pictures has two dogs laying very comfortably on top of a couch with a yellow Afghan in front. So I want to write a selector that will select both of these image tags. So I'll go back over to the selector page. And what I want to do is I want all image elements, and I want the alt attribute that contains Jewel. And I'll submit that. As you can see, we have the one picture with Jewel sitting on her doghouse and the one with Pixel in the picture as well. Because those are the two image elements that have an alt attribute that contains the text Jewel. Now, an important thing to point out here is that what is selected by this selector is an image tag. It's not the attribute. You're using selectors in order to select elements on the page. So that's a little bit different from the earlier examples where the actual elements that were selected by the selector were the last in the series of descendants. So keep that straight. All right, now yet again a little bit more complex example. Say that you wanted to select all of the anchor elements in a table that contain a link to pages external to your website. So those are the anchor elements that are going to have href attributes that begin with http://. Now, you can get a little bit fancier and do HTTPS and so forth, but we don't have any SSL protected links on this page, so we don't need to worry about that. But I don't want to select any other elements on the page. So to be more specific, I want to select these links, but I don't want to select any of these. All right, so I want all elements that are a descendant of TD, and I want to match on anchor elements. And I'll use the caret equals http:// because this is going to discriminate for only external links, but any links within the website aren't going to be matched on by this selector, unless I happen to include the full link to another page on the website. But typically I don't do that within HTML pages. All right, I'll go ahead and submit that. And as you can see, we've selected all of the links within the table, but none of the other links on the page. And we also get confirmation there's a total of 4 selected elements on the page. Now, one thing about this particular selector is that if we had used nested tables to position elements on the page, now using nested tables in order to position things is now considered a bad practice, but it's still pretty widely done. But if you use nested tables rather than floating divs, which is really the better way to do it and use cascading style sheets, then this selector might not work the way we want it. If the list of cities and organizations were within a table, those links here would have matched as well. In that case, you'd have to use a different selector. The moral of that story, again, is to use good web design practices and understand that jQuery selectors are highly dependent upon the structure of the page. So you need to be careful. If you go in and change the structure of your page and you use jQuery selectors extensively in the page code, that may require changing your selectors so you still get the same effects that you want. All right, another thing you can do is match on multiple attribute values. In that case, you can just change them together by including multiple square bracketed attributes and values. So let's say that we wanted to find all of the JPEG images of Pippi on the page, one of the dogs. In that case, you can once again select on Images. I want a source attribute that ends with a JPEG, .jpg, and if I had JPEG and so forth, I'd have to vary this a little bit. So I want all JPEG images, and I also want the alt attribute to match on Pippi. So that's chaining together multiple selections. As you can see, we have a single image on the page, and there's Pippi right there. That's another case where it's a little bit dependent upon the structure of the page, because if Pippi's image could be either a JPEG or a PNG, then this selector wouldn't work. It would only find the images where Pippi's picture was a JPEG. All right, let's talk again a little bit about selector context. I mentioned this earlier. Whenever you use this jQuery selector test page, there really has been a bit of magic going on, or a bit of magical misdirection. Up to this point, I've been using the test page to demonstrate the effect of different selectors. And the misdirection is that the wrapped set class in the test page has only been applied to the right side of the page, this Alaska inquiry form. None of the elements on the left side of the page have ever been selected. So let's go back to a selector that we looked at a little bit earlier. So I want all images, and I want all input elements of type equals text. And I'll submit that. There's only one text box that matches that criteria, and then all of the images are selected as well. But this text box was not selected, because there's nothing in this selector that eliminates any of the text boxes whatsoever. In fact, to drive home the point, if I go back over to the source here and come up here above the sample HTML, here's that input element of type text. So by all rights, that should have been selected. So the reason I get this behavior in the page is what I mentioned a little bit earlier, is that the jQuery function has a second argument, which is the context for the element search. When you omit the argument, jQuery is going to start its search at the DOM root element, which means that it's going to include all elements on the page within that search. But if you provide a context for the element search, then jQuery is going to use that as the search root. So in the test page, the sample HTML is the root. So if we go back up into the code here, again, I'm passing that element name as a valid jQuery selector as the second parameter to the jQuery function here. And that's the reason why when I match on these selectors that are contained within that variable, it's going to use that sample HTML as the root for the search. It's not starting at the root on the page because that would include that left side of the page as well. Now, the context here can be an element reference as it is here, but it can also be just about any jQuery selector and even a set of elements. The result is that you're not limited to a single root element for the element search. You can search different portions of the page. And this can be a really powerful technique, letting you search only a portion of a page for matching elements, rather than trying to concoct selectors that have to work too hard to select the subset of elements that you need. It really was a perfect feature for this particular page. It may not be something you use all the time, but it's a very powerful thing that you can do in order to narrow down the area, essentially filter in advance the area that jQuery looks for matching elements. And just like the selector itself that you specify here, you have a lot of flexibility to write a very complex selector, if that makes sense, in order to identify the root element for the search. Now, one other thing to point out is you might be tempted to use the sample HTML as the selector itself. So I'll go over and do that. Paste that in, click Submit, and notice that we get 0 elements back. So you might be trying to highlight the area where the test page searches for matching elements. But as you can see, it doesn't work. And the reason is that you would essentially be saying that jQuery should look for the sample HTML element within the sample HTML element. Come back over here. This is sample HTML element within this element. But an element doesn't contain itself, and the search finds no matches. So unfortunately, you can be a little bit too clever. The selector features that I've shown you so far provide some powerful and flexible ways to find and select elements on a page. But in some cases, matching elements and their attributes is still too blunt a tool. For example, there's no easy way with what you've seen so far that you could use to select alternating rows in a table, such as when you want odd rows to have a different background color than even rows to make a large table easier to read. This is sometimes called zebra striping, although you're certainly not limited to white and black. For this kind of task, you need a filter. A filter takes the selected elements and filters them down further based on criteria that you select. So let's see how you can do that, specifically with how you can apply zebra striping to the table in the selector test page. Here's a filter that does what we need. Tbody, tr, even. And there's the jQuery filter. Starts with a colon and then has some sort of assigned name that jQuery gave to it. So what this is going to do is it's going to look for all tr elements and in fact match on tr elements that are descendants of tbody, and the table on the page is well-formed HTML, so all tr elements, all rows in the table, are children of tbody, descendants of, strictly speaking. And so once it gets those matching set of elements, jQuery will apply the even filter for just the even rows within the table. And I'll click on Submit, and as you can see, there's 6 rows that match, and there are highlighted rows. But this looks a little bit strange. This is the first row, and that's the second row, but it looks like they're alternating. Well, the thing you need to know here is that, like CSS, the even filter is 0-based. So this is the 0th row. 0 is an even number, so it gets selected. If I actually wanted the alternating rows to be highlighted, then I would need to use the odd filter. And in that case, Bethel, Homer, Kenai, and Kodiak, and so forth would be highlighted instead of the ones that are currently highlighted in yellow. Okay, so the even and odd filters are just 2 of several of what jQuery calls basic filters. There are 3 others that you'll probably use pretty often: header, first, and last. The header is pretty nice because what it does is it selects all of the header elements on the page. So I'll type that in, spell it right, and click on Submit. And now you can see that all H1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements are selected. So you don't have to create a selector that is selecting on those multiple elements. Just use the header filter and you're done. And by the way, notice that I just used the filter by itself. It doesn't need to be attached to another element. Another one of the basic filters that you'll probably use often is first. So let's say that I wanted to highlight the first row in the table. So I could again use tbody, tr, and the first filter. Click on that. And it would help if I actually spelled it right, so I'll change it from tf to tr. And now it's highlighted the first row within that table. So you can start to see these filters are definitely worth learning about because they can save you writing some fairly convoluted select statements in order to access different elements based on their positions within the page or within groups of elements. Similarly, I can use the last filter to select the last row in the table, or the last element in a list, the last whatever in a collection of elements. Just keep in mind that the selector is going to match on the elements that I specify, and I can include attribute selectors and just about any kind of selector that I want, and then it will filter out of those to be the last one. Another very useful basic filter is the not filter. This filter matches all elements that don't match the selector that you specify. Let's say that you wanted to zebra stripe the table, but don't want to change the appearance of the first row in the table. In other words, you don't want to select the first row in the table. In that case, what you can do is once again use tBody and tr and the even filter. So this selector so far is going to select all of the even rows within the table. So we saw that before. But now I want to put on top of that the not filter so that it doesn't select the first row. And there's the effect we get. Once again, the even rows are selected and highlighted, except for the first row. Pretty cool, huh? And the nice thing is it shows how you can chain together filters to get exactly the result that you want. Okay, another category of filters is form filters. And this makes it really easy to select all elements of a given type or in a particular state, and it's associated with elements that you'll find within a form. For example, you can use the button, input, and radio filters to select corresponding HTML elements. So if I wanted to select all radio buttons on the page, I could just do radio, scroll up here, and you can see that I have all the radio buttons selected. You can even use the enabled and selected filters to select all enabled and selected elements respectively. And in this class of filters, the checked filter is particularly useful. The reason it's useful is that if you try to create a selector that checks for the checked attribute equal to checked, which means that the checkbox is checked, that is only going to select the elements that were checked when the page first loaded. In other words, that it has the checked attribute set in the HTML source for the page. So that can be useful. You can certainly maybe want to do that. But if you want to get access to the matched set of elements that are currently checked in the page, whether or not they were checked when the page first loaded, then you need to use the checked filter. All right, so if I go ahead and put that in, checked, and click on Submit, I get no selected elements because I don't currently have any checkboxes checked. But if I go in and select, say, ski joring and bear watching, and let's do moose calling as well, and resubmit that filter, now I have 3 matching elements because it's looking at the current state of the page. All right, once again, just to drive home the point, I'll reload the page, clear it all out, and I'll attempt to match on the checked attribute like this. And notice it found no elements. If I select a few and submit it again, it still finds no elements. So that's the difference between those two types of selectors. Now, of course, this would work and would match any elements if I went back into the source and loaded the page so that one or more of these were selected. Maybe I want to give people a hint that they really should try to go ski joring or snow machining or hiking or whatever it might be. All right, another thing you can do with forms is that you can use the not filter with the form filters to find all elements of a particular type that are not in a specific state. So say that you wanted all of the checkboxes that were not currently checked. So the way you might be tempted to do this is this right here, not checked. Okay. And the idea being is that you want to find all elements that aren't checked. The problem is that that's exactly what it does. Notice that it selects, well, just about everything on the page other than the checkboxes that I do in fact have checked. The reason I got this result is that sometimes the jQuery selectors take you a little bit too literally. So if an element does not have a checked attribute that it currently set to checked, it's going to select that. The problem is that H3 elements don't have a checked attribute. You certainly could add it, but the page isn't going to do anything with it. Text boxes, and so forth, that just makes absolutely no sense. So this selector is not going to be successful. Instead, what you need to do is first select the particular types of elements that you want. So in this case, I want all input elements with type equal checkbox. And so now, once I am going to match on just text boxes, now I can apply the not filter with checked. And now I get the effect that I want. So again, it's first selecting all of the elements that can be checked. I have to do that explicitly. And then excluding the ones that are checked. As you can start to see, the not filter is very useful, but you have to be very careful with the logic. And there's a lot of ways that the logic just may not work out the way you want it to. So say that you wanted to match all of the image elements that have a source attribute that is not a JPEG file. So in this particular test page, all of the images use JPEG files. So a proper selector isn't going to select any elements on the page. And that's certainly a valid result. So you might try to do that by creating a selector that selects all image elements with a source value that ends in JPEG, and then wrapping it in a not filter. And something like that would look like, actually create first the image, the source attribute set equal to, that ends in, okay? So that's the beginning filter, and then wrapping around it a not filter. Okay? So you're selecting all images that don't end in JPEG, and then knotting it. And once again, you get the wrong result. So we're just using the not filter in the incorrect way. So as a practical matter, anytime you write a selector in the test page that highlights the entire page, besides being a little bit painful on the eyes, it's a pretty good sign that there's something wrong with the selector. Unless you really want to select all or most elements, which in a real-world application you're going to do extremely rarely, you should write selectors to select the smallest number of elements that you need to get the job done. Anything more and you're wasting processing cycles, taking an action on elements that don't need anything done or can't do it anyway. So think simple and concise. All right, so again, what we need to do is write the selector to initially select just image elements, and then filter out the ones that contain a JPEG file in the source attribute. And that would look something like this. I can modify that, but I'm just going to start from scratch. So image, and then you don't want the ones with a source attribute that is not equal to JPEG. And submit on that, and there you go. So we know we have a proper selector because no images are selected, because they're all JPEGs. Hopefully at this point, you're getting the idea that jQuery filters provide a lot of power and finesse on top of the selectors for elements and attributes. But there is even more. There are content filters that let you filter based on whether elements contain specific text or are empty, or contain certain types of elements, or even if they have children. Visibility filters select elements that are hidden or visible. Finally, there are a rich set of hierarchy and child filters that let you find elements within the element hierarchy of the DOM, such as to find the first, last, and nth child. It may take a little thought and experimentation, but you can almost certainly create a selector that matches exactly the set of elements that you want on any page. It's definitely worthwhile spending some quality time on the jQuery documentation site to really get your head around all of the filters that are available. There's a very rich source of filters. All the more surprising that they crammed them all into that relatively small jQuery library file. Now, by the way, the nth child filter is a bit of an anomaly in that it starts counting from 1 instead of 0 as the other jQuery selectors do. So keep that in mind if you start playing around with different child filters. This is purely for CSS compatibility. So although you'll have to remember this inconsistency compared to other jQuery selectors, if you write a lot of CSS, then you won't have to remember a discrepancy between jQuery and CSS. Okay, that's a little bit convoluted, but just keep in mind that there's that little bit of an anomaly. Now up to now, you've seen a variety of ways to create wrapped sets, matching sets of elements, using the jQuery function and selectors. In other parts of the course, I'm going to show you a lot of different ways to make use of those wrapped sets using wrapper methods, which can perform various actions on multiple selected elements, and various other techniques. But I want to explore now just a little bit more about the wrapped sets and chaining. The nice thing about working with wrapped sets and wrapper methods is that you don't have to write any tedious looping code in JavaScript to process each element in the wrapped set one by one. The wrapper methods in jQuery do that internally for you, so that just a single call to a method will act on every element in the set. And you saw an example of that kind of action on multiple elements in this kind of a statement. This is the code on the test page that executes based on the selector that you enter for evaluation. It looks for all of the image or input elements of type text using one of the sample selectors that we looked at within the sample HTML area, and it uses the wrapper method to add the wrapped set class to all of the elements in that matched set. That's how the elements on the right-hand side of the test page were highlighted in the red border and the yellow background. So this statement actually consists of two wrapper methods, the jQuery function itself and add class chained together. The jQuery function uses a selector to create the wrapped set and returns that wrapped set as the function's return value. That makes the wrapped set available to the add class method. So the add class method acts on that same wrapped set. And this is where it really gets kind of interesting. Add class as a wrapper method again returns that same wrapped set as its return value. So you can continue to chain method calls onto the end of that statement to perform other actions, all in a single, potentially very long, JavaScript and jQuery statement. Now, jQuery has methods that let you manage the wrapped set as you chain together several methods to act on the elements. For example, you can get the number of elements in the current wrapped set using the length property of the wrapped set. So the test page uses this little bit of code in order to display the number of matched elements on the left side of the page. So the first statement executes the add class method. So that's going to add the wrapped set class to those selected items. And then the second statement uses the length property of that wrapped set object to display the element count. And the HTML method internally uses the browser's inner HTML property to change the contents of the selected element. So another way you could do this is by using the size method instead of the length property to do the same thing as the second statement there. So once you get a feel for jQuery and these wrap sets and chaining, you can do some very powerful things.